Okay, welcome to a concept called risk in finance. It's a commonly used term. We call it risk, and least understood terms by various people who are new to finance. So let's understand what is risk in our general language. Whenever you talk about risk, let's say you want to start your own business, you talk about risk. Now people say don't worry about risk, look at growth, right? The focus is generally in projections. Now what will be the next year revenue? What will be the money come next year, next to next year, so on. People do not worry much about risk. Even if they do worry, they think they cannot do much with that risk. Now when you talk to people that there is a risk in this venture, what they say is, well, if you go out on a street, right, there is a risk of an accident happening there. If, let's say, the traffic lights are not working, you can hit by a bus, hit by a car. So risk is everywhere. So same is true here. So why worry about risk? I agree that risk is everywhere, but there's a notion of high risk, low risk, okay, much less risk, much high risk. So even if risk is there when you go out on street, or when you start a business, or when you make an investment in real estate property, or you make an investment in a fixed deposit in a bank like Lehman Brothers, now everywhere there is risk, that's right. But that does not mean that we should not account for risk. So risk needs to be accounted, and we should know that there is a degree of risk. Risk can be high risk, risk can be low risk. So that's the starting point, that we need to compare risk between two choices. Okay, growth, cash inflows, future projections are good, but we need to focus on risk as well. What if things don't go as expected? What if the scenario changes? What if there's a market slowdown? So that's all part of risk, and we should understand this risk very, very carefully. So with that, let's understand one basic graph, which is a graph between risk and returns. Okay, now these are returns that you expect. These are not the returns that have happened. What should be the nature of this relationship? Okay, if the risk increases in a particular choice, in a particular investment, so x-axis is the increase in risk, y-axis is the increase in returns, increase in expected returns, not what you would definitely get, but what you expect. And the relationship between these two is upward sloping, which means that if you are willing to take low risk, you should expect low returns. You may or may not get. If you are taking a high risk, your expectation should be high returns. Okay, so you can see that low risk, low returns, high risk, high returns. Okay, so remember this, whenever you take high risk, it's not guaranteed that you will get high returns, but you have an expectations of high returns. And if the expectations are not low, not high, for example, if there is something which is here, which gives you, which makes you take high risk, but has an expectation of low returns, then it's not a good choice, not a good investment. In other words, we are saying that if you make your deposits in fixed deposit, FD, in a bank, let's say HDFC Bank in India, or you can say Citibank. Now if you make a fixed deposit here, you expect low returns and you get low returns, which is 7 to 8%. That's right. But if you make an investment in real estate, okay, or stock market, now when you invest in these, your expected returns, you should expect at least a higher number than a fixed deposit, which can be like 20% or 30%. Okay. If you think that this is not an expected return, this is not your expectation, you should not invest here, because these are high risk. Okay, so let's go further on this one. We were talking about risk and return, risk on x-axis and return on y-axis. Now we are saying the relationship is upward sloping, and this is the expected returns. I'll talk about expected returns now. Now what I'm saying today is that if you're willing to take low risk, your expectations of return should be low. If you're willing to take high risk, your expectations of your return should be high. If that's not the case, then you are not investing wisely, or you're not taking wise choices. Okay, so let's understand expected returns now. What is expected return? Okay, this is not the return that has happened, this is the future expectations. Okay, so that's how we compute. So let's say I invest in a stock and I call it a Reliance stock. Okay, so I invest in this stock, then the investment is worth 800 rupees. Okay, and now I know the risk in the Reliance, so let me just call it risk. So I know the risk in this company, and I want to know the future return that I will get. What will be my return, let's say after 1 year? So return after 1 year, how to compute? Now then I say the natural growth pattern of Reliance is 10%, and hence it should be 880. Okay, if everything goes fine, so let me call it a normal scenario. Okay, a normal scenario, the value should be 880 and the return should be 10%. Okay, but I may or may not get a normal scenario. I might say there is an optimistic scenario. If market goes up because of certain reason, that there is a upward trend, a bullish trend in market, and as a result it's not 880, it's actually 20%. So the growth is 20%, which is 0, 6 and 960. So you add 2 80s and you say 960. But the things can be worse. Suppose India hits with a recession, or some part of the geography there's a recession and there is a bearish sentiments and markets goes down, and I call it as a pessimistic scenario. Okay, and in pessimistic scenario I say, well, things can be not so good, and the Reliance stock just goes 840, which means a 5% growth. Now I have 3 values. Now you can clearly see there are 3 values, right? It can be 5%, 10% or 20%. So what is my future return? How much I can expect for the risk I am taking in Reliance stock? Now the answer comes through a concept of expected returns, and the way expected return is calculated is by understanding scenarios. So there are 3 scenarios: pessimistic, normal, optimistic. Very basic 3 scenarios, right? Then you assign probability to those scenarios. What's probability? Probability is the chance of this scenario occurring. So you talk to the experts who are expert in the markets and you check what is the chance of a pessimistic market coming year, and then they say, well, there's a 20% chance. Okay, so this is probability. I hope you understand probability. Probability is the chance of a particular thing divided by the total possibilities. So we say 20% probability means 0.2. So 20% out of 100% is for pessimistic, and then I say for normal, and it says there's a 60% chance that we remain in a normal state. Okay, and there is another 20% chance we enter into an optimistic stage. So it's a 0.6 probability, 0.2 probability, and if you remember, these were different returns per scenario. So what you have now? So you have returns, you have probabilities. Okay, now we come to our concept of expected return, and we say, well, expected return, it's sometimes written as ER. Expected return is the probability PI into the return I for that scenario. Probability of that scenario, return of that scenario, and you keep adding them up. So you put a summation sign for I equal to 1 to n, assuming there are n scenarios. So in this example, my expected return is equal to, now you can easily guess, this is the return and this is the probability. So you say 5% into 0.2, then the second return 10% into the chance of that scenario 0.6 plus 20% into the chance, which is 0.2. Can you see that? R1 P1, R2 P2, R3 P3, and then you multiply all that. So 5% into 0.2, that's chance is 1%, then you say 10 into this 6%, so 10 and 20 into 0.2, that's like 4%, and then you say the expected return, right, for investing in Reliance stock is 11%. Can you see that? I'm saying the expected returns are 11%. It does not mean that the actual return will be 11%. This is an important thing. The actual return can be something like, the actual return can be 5%, can be 10, 20, depending on the scenario, but my expected return, considering all probabilities, all possible scenarios, is 11%. And I would look at the risk in the Reliance and see, is 11% okay? No, it's not okay, because the risk is higher than a bank's risk. Okay, so I can see the bank, right? I can look at HDFC Bank and I say that, well, the HDFC Bank is giving me 11% for making a fixed deposit, right? And I look at the risk in the bank is much less than the risk in Reliance company. Hence, right, I should be going for a bank fixed deposit, because Reliance, even though it can give me 20% in one of these scenarios, but I should not look at this 20% in optimistic scenario. I should not look at 5% in pessimistic scenario. What I should look at is the expected return. So don't go by, somebody's optimistic view or go by somebody's pessimistic view to take your decision. What we are saying is, look at the probability of each scenario by talking to expert and multiply the probability with your returns during that scenario, and then get an expected return, which is, you can say, one number to represent, all three or all n number of scenarios that you can predict. And this expected returns is compared against the risk, and you put that expected return on this side and risk is on that side. You are always and always looking for a point which gives you highest return for a particular risk. So if we are talking about this risk, you would like to move as up as possible. And if there is an investment which gives you somewhere here, okay, which means that there is an investment which is somewhere here, right? So for a given risk, right, this is giving you the highest return. Can you see highest return? So you will not invest on this, not here, not here. You will pick an investment point which is give you an expected return of this for a given risk like this. Okay, so with that, what we are saying is risk is measurable, right? That's the first point. It is measurable. Okay, it's not about, there is risk or there is not a risk, high risk, low risk. No, there is a degree of risk. We say this is high risk, there is low risk. And in one of the next videos, we will talk about what is the thermometer to measure risk, right? Just like we have thermometer to measure temperature, so risk is like a temperature, and there's a thermometer instrument to measure risk. But today we are saying that the expected returns, right, is not the actual returns, but what you expect, and they are the multiplication of probability into returns. And we should always think about expected returns and the risk before making any investments. Okay, so with that, let's close the topic of risk by quickly revising, and this time with a little music in the background. Okay, so even if people say there is risk everywhere, right, the risk keeps changing, right, depending on the choice you take. And if you are trying to invest in a higher risky, if you're starting your own business, it's a high risk, it must have a high expected returns. If it does not have a high expected returns, no point in taking high risk. Okay, so make sure the expected returns is calculated first, and the expected returns is calculated by saying if things go bad, what will happen? If things remain normal, if things remain very optimistic, what are the possible profit points, or what is the possible return? And once you get those returns, you should put the chance of being pessimistic, being normal, and optimistic. Okay, if you're not sure, at least give them equidistant probability or same probability, 50-50 to both sides, and then compute your expected return. Compare your expected return with similar kind of choices that you have, like your business, and if you find your expected returns are quite okay compared to the risk you take, you should go for it, otherwise not. And finally, we close down saying risk is measurable, and there is a thermometer, there's an instrument to measure risk. We'll talk about that later, but we should always think in terms of expected returns, which are your future expectation based on probability of a scenario and the return in that scenario, and compare it against the risk to take decision. Thank you very much.